Hey everybody, I'm Rob Childs, a rapier swordsman out of the United States, and for those of you who have fenced me before, you know that I'm something of a control freak when it comes to my opponent's weapons. I like to make sure that I exert that control before I attack my opponent so as to ensure that only one person is going to be struck in that exchange. Well, today I'm going to be talking to you about one of the ways in which I exert that control, and that is a technique I call the lockdown. The first part of the lockdown technique requires you to thrust the space to the inside line of your opponent's weapon. Note, my sword does not touch my opponent's weapon at this stage, and the reason for that is because I don't want to turn my opponent's defenses on right now. I don't want them moving or doing anything at all until it is a reaction to what I'm about to do to them next. If I touch them here, then they're already moving, they could end up stepping away, they could end up moving their sword. I've given a tell that indicates I am about to do something more to their weapon. So again, the first stage, thrust the space to the inside line of your opponent's weapon. Do not touch the sword. Now in the second stage, two things are going to happen at the same time. The sword is going to move through a very specific sequence of actions, and my body is going to move forward and down. But because these are two separate actions happening simultaneously, I'm going to break each one of them down for you right now separately so you can see each one in more specific detail. Let's first talk about the sword. At this stage, I am now going to make contact with my opponent's weapon, moving their sword point maybe an inch or so to the outside line even further. Then my arm moves my sword in such a fashion that I rise up and then shove them down as my body moves forward, until such time as I put them into now what I call the inferior position. Their sword is below my weapon and pushed to such a place that they can't effectively harm me, but my sword is in a very good position to threaten them in the very next movement. This is how we move my sword and pushing them into the inferior position. So you might be asking yourself, why do you have to move the sword arm in such an odd position in order to move your opponent's weapon into the inferior position? Well, it's a very good question, and one that I discovered a long time ago the answer. The reason why you have to move your arm basically in such a position that you're exerting a right angle force on your opponent's weapon is because if you thrust the space and then all you did was move at the wrist, which is an instinct for people to do, and you don't want to do that. But if you move at the wrist such that you're basically just slicing your sword through a curve, then what you're going to end up doing is slinging your opponent's weapon away, and now you have lost that control that you fought so hard to gain in the first place. So when you go through this action, trust me, it's two separate directions that you're moving, but over the course of the technique itself, when you are versed in it, it happens in the blink of an eye, both actions, and your opponent will be in the inferior position before they know what hit them. Okay, so that's what the sword does. Now let's talk about what the body does. The movement of the body is critical during this phase because, as I had mentioned at the beginning of the technique itself, that you want to gain a measure to your opponent's sword. But that measure is not sufficient for you to be able to attack your opponent's body, which is ultimately the goal of every swordsman's contest, correct? So, while your sword is moving through the positions, in order to put your opponent's blade in the inferior position, your body simultaneously must move to the next measure, which is going to be the measure of the attack that will follow on in stage 3 that finishes your opponent. But first, let's see how we actually go through those motions. Okay, so here I am at the proper measure to my opponent's weapon. I have thrust the space to the inside line of their sword, and now my arm is positioning and starting to move their weapon into the inferior position. Simultaneously now, my body must close to the next measure. So, while my sword is pushing over and shoving down, my body is going to take a large step forward, and as my back foot comes up, very important piece here, as your back foot comes up, you're not just simply going to settle back into an on-guard stance at the same height that you were before. No, you're going to step and then sink even lower in order to push your opponent into that vulnerable position we talked about earlier, but also too, this ensures that your opponent can't simply disengage your blade and make a thrust to the body. If you don't sink down on this phase, then your opponent has a very easy avenue to escape the lockdown position that you're trying to put them into. So again, thrust the space, And then the sword is moving to put your opponent's weapon into the inferior position, and your body sinks down very low in order to put them into that incredibly weak position that they now find themselves in. If you're like me and you like to fence with rapier and dagger, then when you perform the lockdown against your opponent, your dagger has a specific place to be. So as your sword pushes your opponent's weapon into the inferior position, thrust your dagger to the inside line of their sword while you perform this maneuver. What happens now is you've got them locked from above and you have them locked from below. In order for your opponent to have any viable means of striking back at you, they now have to withdraw their weapon, which of course takes time. Now, if your opponent is burning more time than you, well, clearly there's an advantage there, and chances are, if you are an experienced swordsman and versed in this particular tactic, you're going to ventilate your opponent long before they can even bring their sword to bear. So once you have placed your opponent in the inferior position, you will note that there is a wide avenue of attack open to your opponent's upper quadrant. You thrust them into the inferior position, and it is really just a simple matter of turning the wrist and thrusting, and it is a very quick, wickedly fast attack. But as we all know, there's no such thing as an unstoppable move. So if you've done this against your opponent a couple of times, in all likelihood, they are probably starting to get wise to it and are starting to put, maybe it's a buckler or it's a dagger, whatever it is in their offhand, that is a proper response to the thrust. Fortunately, however, the lockdown technique opens up your opponent to more than just a simple thrust to the body. It also will open up your opponent to things like the cut. Or, as the case may be, maybe your opponent doesn't have something in their offhand, or they haven't thought about putting that in place. So when you perform the lockdown and you shove them into the inferior position, they might realize then, holy cow, I'm very vulnerable and I'm going to get the heck out of dodge. Well, in the instance where your opponent starts to retreat away from you, just simply follow them and hit them wherever they are not. So hopefully this answers some questions in regard to some of the signature moves that I like to employ whenever I am fencing. Like I said, I am a control freak when it comes to my opponent's weapon. I like to exert all kinds of control against that in order to ensure that I am not going to be struck at the same time, or even as the case may be, a moment after I have struck my opponent. When only one person is hit, then you've done it right.